Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center here at MSU. And Eye on Africa is our weekly seminary series. So today I'm very delighted to have Dr. Wilfahrt as our guest. Before I hand it over to her, a brief introduction. So Dr. Wilfahrt is an Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley, where she studied African politics. Her current research interests revolve around two themes. The first focuses on historical legacies in contemporary African politics, with a particular interest in the persistence of social norms. Her first book, Precolonial Legacies in Postcolonial Politics, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021, argues that the contemporary politics of representation and local service provision in Senegal following democratic decentralization are intimately shaped by the pre-colonial past, where local government overlap with informal social institutions inherited from pre-colonial polities. Local elites are better positioned to coordinate local governance effort in the present. A second ongoing stream of research studies the politics of field research in the Global South. So thank you so much, Dr. Wilfahrt, for being here. Now I hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So thanks to AWA and to the African Studies Center at MSU. So I'm going to be presenting a paper that I've been working on for a while, and it's a project that's trying to take African historiography seriously in a series of ongoing debates in political science and economics in particular. So in some ways, I'm going to acknowledge that this talk is a bit abstract, but I'm going to try to make it as concrete as possible. And I really value the input from an audience with sort of a diverse disciplinary background about how much you buy any of this or not. So over the last decade, social scientists have increasingly renewed their interest in questions of how the past shapes the lived experiences of individuals around the world today. And so the emergence of what sometimes is called the historical renaissance in economics or historical political economy has generated a number of often quite bold theoretical and empirical claims about how historical legacies, so events that took place in the past or institutions that existed in the past, shape sort of core questions in the social sciences today. So why are some countries rich and others are poor? Why do some subnational regions have high state capacity while in others it's quite weak? And so my starting point in this project is very much rooted in this renewed interest in history, but it's motivated by a real dissatisfaction with how we've thought about these historical causes. And I think this is a problem that's been particularly acute in much of the work in this vein that has focused in sub-Saharan Africa due to questions of the historical record. And also I think, I have some more cynical interpretations. I can get into those later. So not only does this research agenda embrace a really powerful view of history, it also sort of has real implications, or it lays out real implications for how we would think about improving socio-political or questions of regimes, et cetera, around the world. But as I'm going to argue, I think that much of this research agenda has produced sort of often contradictory or at the least non-cumulative findings in a way that the literature hasn't really stopped to wrestle with yet. I think a lot of people prioritize having their cool new finding or their cool new data or identification strategy. And I want to sort of stop and pause in this project to sort of say, well, what are we talking about, right? And how, if we take seriously what we're talking about, can we sort of maybe start to think about ways to have theoretical progress or clarity? So I'm going to focus in this talk and focusing in this project on sort of one core element of this, which is an increased interest in sort of the role of historical political centralization. And so there's been a series of claims globally, but also a number of papers focusing on sub-Saharan Africa that argue that areas that were home to centralized political forms in this case, the putatively pre-colonial period, right, see better economic growth and state capacity. Studies have shown that these areas of Africa have better development outcomes on average. But on the other hand, we also have a number of papers that would say, well, these regions also see higher support for autocracy, and a couple of papers have shown that this also seems to be increasing civil conflict. So we often don't think that development and conflict go necessarily super well together. We often think that conflict tends to undermine development gains or sort of impede them. And I want to sort of think about this type of contradictory finding in this paper. And so just to sort of illustrate this more concretely, if we look at sort of a body of almost 50 papers that have come out in the last decade or so, about, almost 60% have suggested that there's a positive effect of long run, exposure or sort of historical exposure to centralized political forms. And about a quarter suggest that there's negative effects. The positive findings tend to be really concentrated in work looking at development outcomes, but there's a fair amount of debate on the negative ones. And then there's a number of findings that suggest that it's mixed, that in some cases it's positive and some it's not. So in this talk, I'm trying to resolve this paradox, or what I'm going to call a paradox, by sort of suggesting we need to engage with the historical cause, which is this idea of political centralization. And the literature today tends to really blur what that concept is. Like, what do we mean when we're talking about political centralization? And then once we migrate into measurement, we tend to sort of even see more confusion, perhaps. So I want to suggest that there's two problems that we need to resolve. So the first, is a conceptual problem, which is this question: what do we mean by political centralization? In particular, I'm concerned with trying to develop a measure, a conceptual definition that is both portable across space and can capture a wide variety of political forms, and importantly, that sort of eschews the trappings of sort of the Weberian state that I think dominates a lot of how we think about state building in comparative perspective. The second question is then a measurement question. So once we come up with a satisfactory, conceptualization of what we mean by political centralization, how would we actually go about estimating this? So I'm going to be focusing on the case of 19th century Africa. And so how can we sort of take an idea of sort of what do we mean by centralization, and then identify, well, where would we sort of say that we do in fact see that in the world? So first, how do we identify the universe of cases? And then secondly, how could we come up with sort of some measure of the felt presence of those polities in space? And so this is a really thorny puzzle, right? So if we want to map centralized polities, even with all the caveats that we can talk about soft borders, about power projected unevenly across space, right? There's a sort of a difficult measurement problem that I'm going to try to tackle as well. So to give you an outline of the talk, I'm going to first lay out what I hope is a somewhat plausible definition of political centralization, or how we might identify a political order that is centralized. I'm then going to sort of, from that definition, propose a measure, which I'm calling an Atlas of 19th century African centralized polities, which I'm going to sort of release publicly once it's done. And then I'm going to sort of return to this debate about these apparently non-cumulative findings about the long-run impact of political centralization on the continent, and suggest that by taking seriously the concept, we can think very productively about types of states, right? And sort of come up with sort of some progress in this literature that might suggest important mechanisms of persistence that are going to vary and that we would want to be attentive to. So I'm going to start by sort of this question of what is political centralization. So again, looking at the same body of papers that has sort of recently come out on this general topic, we see that over 60% of those papers claim to be talking about states or kingdoms. So all of these papers, to some degree or another, are sort of building on each other or speaking to each other, right? So they at least all sort of are nodding to the fact that they want to be studying the same set of phenomenon in the world or in history, right? But some of them are really explicitly saying, well, what I mean by this, by centralization, is kingdoms or states. Others sort of take a step back from that language and say they're talking about complex institutions, or just stick with the language of political centralization. About 10% explicitly say that they consider political centralization to be a property of ethnic groups. And then a few papers say that this is chiefly hierarchies, and so again are taking a step back from the language of states. So on the one hand, this might suggest a fair amount of conceptual convergence. It seems like most of this literature really wants to know something about some form of political institutions that existed in the past, right? That looked state-like, right? But what is actually considered state-like enough to enter into these studies is rarely discussed. So for example, in a data set that she built, a French economist, Elise Wheelery, codes a number of attributes, and she's primarily focused on the colonial era, but at the level of the 1925 siècle and the AOF in West Africa, right? And she includes as a variable whether or not within that siècle there was, prior to the onset of French colonial rule, evidence of pre-colonial political development. Right? What is sufficient or insufficient to sort of score a 1 on that variable or not is not clear. She never tells us, right? And so this is the sort of ways in which sort of it's not the threshold, right, for sort of when you would get that and when you wouldn't is not clear. In other work, we sort of see a fair amount of conceptual stretching across work. So in a really early paper in this literature, Ganoli and Reiner, two economists, ambiguously define this as pre-colonial chiefly hierarchies. They say, we're showing there's a long run effect of, where there are more hierarchical chiefdoms. But in later work, building on this exact paper and sort of using their data, Kaplan and Soren cite them and say they're expanding this study, but then say that what they're actually measuring is pre-colonial kingdoms, right? And I would argue that those are two very distinct understandings of both a threshold of centralization and what types of institutions in the past would be engendering long-run effects. And so what this raises, this question that I think this raises, do we know a state when we see a state? And I think this is easy to do in this literature because there's this really heavy hanging idea of the Western state in a lot of this literature. So of course, there's nothing right or wrong with how any of these authors decide to, conceptualize political centralization as a concept, right? But if we think the past matters, I think we do need to be very precise about sort of identify scope conditions for arguments, and importantly, why we would think that these legacies would persist to the present. So the main conceptual move that I'm trying to do in this project is sort of come up with a flexible definition of political centralization. And I seek a definition here that is internally consistent. So I want a concept that would allow us to move across time and space. I don't want to sort of come up with a concept that is heavily influenced by, experiences in, say, the 20th century, and then attempt to sort of suggest that we need it to force it to move backwards in time. But we also, of course, want a concept that's externally valid. So we need a concept that corresponds to the world, and in this case, to the historical record, or what we know about African political forms in sort of the, again, prior to the onset of full colonial rule. And so I'm going to suggest that at a base, to think about political centralization demands that we think about a center and a periphery, right? And so there has to be some centralization to a center. And this doesn't sort of, some amassing of power to a center. And I don't mean by this necessarily something spatial, although of course it might have spatial dimensions, but that there has to be some sort of core node that is holding power in a polity. So if there is no clear center, so for example, if we think about diffusive defensive arrangements among villages, but there is no sort of, we would say that each of those villages would have sort of equal amounts of power or authority and only come together occasionally for defense, I would say that's probably not a case of political centralization because we can't clearly identify a center and a periphery, right? And so in turn, I argue that to have a center, to identify the presence of a center demands three component parts. The first is that there has to be some element of social segmentation. So social differentiation is core to classic definitions of the state. And so what I mean by this is that there has to be some elite that sits on top of a durable social hierarchy that are limiting to some degree or another political, economic, and social mobility. So if we think across 19th century Africa, in some cases, this elite and sort of the nature of social segmentation was based on ethnicity. In West Africa or Senegal, an area that I've spent a lot of time thinking about this question, there was often caste-based hierarchies that sort of limited who could or could not enter into the ruling class. In some contexts, this might be lineage, it might be spiritual attribute, etc. And so this can be quite flexible about what defines social segmentation. But this allows us to sort of define, who can hold power and hence who can sort of define the center. This also allows me to distinguish this from lower chiefdoms, where social hierarchy might not be durable, right? And also cases where we might have a single leader or chief who has, amassed some power, but we don't sort of see these durable markers of social status that I would say we sort of need to sort of have a well-entrenched center. The second element is that there has to be some extraction of economic surplus. So something has to sort of flow from the sort of periphery to the center. This could be things like regularized tribute, trade taxes, obligatory labor. This has long been considered a defining political goal of leaders. And the surplus, of course, can be used for any number of things, maintaining patronage networks, building and maintaining an ideological apparatus, etc. The third and final element of the concept is that there has to be some form of an institutionalized territorial administration. So I want to be very clear that what I do not mean here is that there has to be some clear Cartesian element to political power with firm borders. What I mean instead is that there has to be some form of representation of the center locally. That the center has to have some authority, even if it's thin, and even if it's heavily circumscribed in the sort of issue domain to regulate social and economic life. So for example, in a number of pre-colonial polities on the continent, Judicial affairs are largely left to local leaders, but there are certain categories of crimes or certain categories of punishment, like capital punishment, that can only be handled by the center, right? And so in this case, even though the center is not actively regulating the vast majority of judicial cases or disputes over land or marriage or whatever, there is a clear domain in which the center has the authority to regulate sort of people's everyday lives, right? So what I think this third dimension does is it focuses our attention on the sort of need for evidence of cooperation between center and periphery. I don't mean cooperation to just have a positive influence here, right? This could be something like the center sort of organizing or sort of being able to, coerce, but sort of by effect organize for, some form of shared military defense, for example. So if the center has the ability to conscript troops or raise troops when needed for military defense or military expeditions, right, I would consider this evidence of sort of some form of cooperation. And this also allows me to sort of distinguish between communities that we would consider actually to be integrated into a polity and places that might be occasional tribute payers, right? So for example, there are many pre-colonial, polities in the region where there are known areas that occasionally leaders are going to for tribute, but they aren't actually attempting to maintain regularized brokerage interactions with local leaders. They aren't, there isn't necessarily an institutionalized tribute system, et cetera. It's just every few years they might arrive in an area and sort of extract something. And those areas, I would argue, are sort of not fully integrated into a polity. I wouldn't consider that sort of the main periphery of a polity. So this is a very Weber-free definition, right? And in particular, I want to move away from this idea that you have to have some monopoly on the legitimate use of force to have something that resembles something state-like, right? Because I think once we've monopolized the use of force, the core dilemma of centralization is resolved. And it would truncate this, our understanding of political centralization to cases where it's a settled question, where power is firmly centralized. But I think we'd want to really look at cases where sort of centralization is an ongoing process. And I think with an eye to sort of the region that I'm studying, this would sort of allow us to sort of take into account longstanding claims that things like political fission are a core dynamic in sort of pre-colonial political organization in the region. I also want to use the word polities and not states and sort of, move a step a bit, take a large step back from some of this again, heavily influenced by the Western experience understanding of the state, because I really want to sort of avoid the trap of reading history backwards, right? So taking concepts that we know and are quite comfortable and familiar with in the present and sort of attempting to look for it in history. And so instead, I've tried to develop what hopefully can be a flexible concept sort of both for the region and more broadly. So that's the first part of the project, is to sort of say, look, all of this literature says that there's something happening with long run effects of pre-colonial centralization or sort of, political centralization. But I don't think that we actually are sort of always talking about the same thing. And so I'm trying to come up with a concept that sort of can help us, think about the same thing, but also sort of that is makes sense in the context that I want to be working in. The second element then is the challenge of how do you measure this, right? So part of the reason that I think we need a clear concept is because I think this literature is muddled because of sort of a lot of mismatch between concept and measurement. So looking at the same body of papers that these past graphs have looked at, I am showing you here how most papers have measured political centralization. And what we can see is that over half of papers, or about half of papers, have relied on data by George Murdoch, which some of you might be familiar with. So George Murdoch was an anthropologist, and his lifelong project was to create an inventory of the world's ethnic groups. He was putatively coding these, the attributes of these groups to the eve of colonization. Right? We can debate that, and has certainly been criticized. But among this data set, there is this, variable 33 in his data set. It's called jurisdictional hierarchy, and it ranges from 0 to 4. And he is measuring or attempting to measure here the levels of sort of hierarchy within ethnic groups. So a 0 would be an area where there really is no hierarchy, to a 4, which would be a large state. So, the Egyptians, for example. So most of the literature, when I say that they're using Murdoch's data, are sort of taking his measures of variable 33 and they're dichotomizing it, which means that any ethnic group that scores a 2 or higher is considered to be centralized. So a 2 is equivalent to a complex chiefly hierarchy. And anything that scores a 1 or a 0 is considered to be, historically acephalous or not centralized. So this data is very popular because it's widely available. The economist Nathan Nunn georeferences a map that Murdoch included in his 1959 book, Africa, which you can see displayed here. And Nunn, again, Murdoch was claiming that this is where he estimated the location of these ethnic groups to be in the late 1800s. And this allows Nunn to pair the ethnographic atlas project that emerges later, right, to the sort of, where Murdoch at least thought, ethnic groups were located at this time. And so here you can see sort of the distribution. Anything that's orange or red would be considered centralized. Anything that's yellow or green would be considered uncentralized in Murdoch's data. But there also, as you can see, is a lot of missingness in his data. And I, for one, at least would suggest that's pretty non-random, that, in particular, a lot of pastoralist groups seem to be sort of missing from his data. But so this is the data that most people are using. It's very nice if you have a spatial outcome variable, have a nice spatial, independent variable that you can use to measure centralization. And I think this is why this data has been well used. I would also note, a couple economists have actually gone to sort of some lengths to sort of establish the validity of this data. So some people have looked to sort of see if you use Afrobarometer or demographic health survey data, are people of an ethnic group actually clustered today about where they would be by Murdoch's data? And there's some correlation, but yeah, I'll leave it at that. We can talk about that if people want to. So most people are using Murdoch. There are some other measures, right? So some people are georeferencing historical atlases. Some people use this, worldwide state antiquity index, which codes at 50-year intervals at the country level if there was evidence of any form of political, of a state, et cetera. But what I want to highlight is that to the extent that most people are using Murdoch, who is interested in ethnic groups as a culture-bearing unit, right? The majority of people are also claiming that they're studying political institutions. And I, at least, would make the point that I don't think that ethnic groups and ethnic group attributes are conceptually conterminous with the existence of a political institution. Maybe sometimes, right? But we know that most African states were actually multi-ethnic, and the incorporation of non-co-ethnics into polities in the 19th century is sort of an enduring dynamic. I mean, if we think about the wave of states that sort of emerge, northwards into Tanzania from the Mfukane, right? That's all an exercise of sort of incoming groups attempting to conquer territory and then incorporate, non-co-ethnics into the state, right? And build what I would consider to be centralized institutions. So I think we should be very wary of sort of conflating ethnicity with the existence of political institutions, even if those political institutions have at the center a specific ethnic group who's able to control power, right? So, as I said, there have been some recent efforts to come up with other measures. So some people, as I mentioned, have sort of geo-referenced historical atlases. I think this is an improvement because I think these atlases at least want to be sort of measuring the existence of states. But I think that sort of what effectively happens is that this atlas then determines the universe of cases, right? So it's depending on what's in the atlas determines sort of what you think states are. And I think that sort of, again, sort of allows people to escape from actually conceptualizing, like, what do I think this historical thing is that I'm studying? And then what are the examples of that in the world? So the sort of big measurement act that I'm trying to do is sort of construct a new spatial measure of where we would think, we saw the existence of political centralization that meets my definition in the 19th century. So, of course, any effort to do this is not free of bias. There are very uneven, and of course, they're very evolving historiographies of many of these polities. Polities located closer to the coast who had more early contact with Europeans have better archival records. Large states tend to be better studied. Following, the end of World War II, when we sort of see a resurgent interest in the study of African kingdoms, I think there's a lot of really excellent work done, but it tends to be focused on polities that really resembled more European-like states. So, Syria, for example. And so I want to sort of state up front, right, that this is not a perfect exercise. And one of the criticisms of Murdoch has been that he's using a lot of data constructed in the colonial and post-colonial period, right, to say something about the pre-colonial period. And I can't escape that problem either. What I can do is attempt to read very carefully across sources to sort of see how understandings of polities have changed, right? But I want to be very upfront that, of course, this is not perfect measure, as there is no such thing in the world. But so I proceeded by 4 empirical steps and sort of moving from my concept to sort of a spatial mapping of where we would think there was exposure to centralized political order in the 19th century. So the first is I need to establish a universe of cases. So reading across a lot of sort of general African history, historical dictionaries, as I read about some states, I discovered other states. I came up with a list of 249 centralized polities in the 19th century. If we collapse the Adamawa and Sokoto emirates, right, and things like the Mosi states into single state structures, that number drops to 174. I think that there are theoretical reasons we want to do that. There are also reasons I think that we might want to consider some of these emirates to be independent. So the data set is meant to be flexible, so people can sort of move as they want between these two ways of conceptualizing where we would sort of say the center was. But of course, the core challenge is how do we identify borderline cases, right? And so I'm going to walk through two examples, sort of illustrate how I'm drawing this distinction. And if you find it unsatisfactory, please tell me. So the first is the example of the Nanumba in northern Ghana. So the Nanumba were an ethnic group. They have a shared identity and a shared symbolic loyalty to the chieftaincy, the most prominent of which is the Mbilana. And they also had a court of notables who sort of could benefit from customary communal obligation on their farms. So in this sense, there is a form of social segmentation. There's an enduring chieftaincy that's institutionalized, and there's the extraction of economic surplus on some levels. But I would argue that the Numba falls just short of my definition, in part because there's sort of repeated episodes where we fail to see capacity for cooperation among elites themselves, and then also between the center and the periphery. So Skalnick has a piece in which he talks about the Numba, and he details as one example how facing the arrival of German forces, the three most powerful Numba chiefs failed to coordinate to fight against them, which reflected an inability of the elites to ensure cooperation as a cohesive unit from the center to the periphery. And so Skalnick describes the Numba as a loosely knit system of authority based on the sanctity of tradition rather than the willpower of individuals. And so according to his work and others, I would say that this is a polity or a political organization that probably falls just below my threshold of what a centralized polity would be. Conversely, the INSO of Cameroon was also a very decentralized polity. It's often referred to as a confederacy, but I would argue it's just above this level. So the INSO were ruled by a Fawn, as many of the grassland kingdoms were, who was assisted by a court, which was largely staffed by hereditary titles. So we sort of see this, established social segmentation. There was a clear distinction between commoners and notables. The Fawn was able to extract tribute. Villages were required to provide labor, right? So hence they're meeting my second criteria of extracting economic surplus. And subsidiary chiefdoms were, although administered by sort of their own hereditary dynasty, and although retaining a lot of local autonomy, there's evidence that they sort of were repeatedly sort of following the Fawn on matters of war, on matters of capital punishment, etc. So the Fawn is able to ensure some institutional presence and enable cooperation and coordination between the center and periphery, right? Even though the periphery maintains a lot of autonomy. So in this sense, I would say INSO as a confederacy or a federation, right, meets my definition, right, of a centralized polity. So having come up with the universe of cases, I then sort of attempt to locate these polities in the historical record. And so for each of them, I code a large number of attributes. Some of the examples are listed here, with the idea that this can then sort of provide flexibility for people who might want to use the data in the future and sort of think about different attributes of state building. As I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about in a few minutes, I think one key area of progress for this literature is thinking about variation in types of state forms. So to the present, people have even said polities are centralized, yes or no. But I think that there's a real wealth of variation, and I really want to push back at people like Jeffrey Herbst to argue that there's sort of these structural conditions that create a pretty uniform form of political organization, to suggest that there's a lot more there. And so I sort of code a bunch of things about these states in an effort to sort of create some room for people to explore that. The third step is perhaps in some ways the trickiest, which is I then need to sort of locate those polities in space. So as we know from Jeffrey Herbst or people like Igor Kopitov, right, an enduring feature of political order in the region has sort of been soft and mutable borders that are sort of evolving and sort of moving over time as power is sort of projected unevenly across space. And so this poses this question of how do we measure political orders that have soft borders, right? And so I do this by doing something that I did in my book, which is I sort of create a list of all the centers of power that I can sort of identify in the historical record for each polity. So this would be things like capitals. In many cases, capitals rotated, provincial seats, the fiefdoms of hereditary title holders, et cetera, major markets, religious sites, et cetera. So here you can see an example of the ones that I coded for Nkomi on the Gabonese coast. And I then locate those centers to where I think they were. So the most obvious way to do this is to find where they are today. And in many cases, there's no evidence that these centers have moved, or at least have moved dramatically. It's possible that they've displaced themselves, a kilometer or so. But I think for the purposes of my measure, I should be able to capture that variation. We know, of course, that some places were abandoned. So Oyo, the capital of a Yoruba state in Nigeria, is now in a national park. It's now a ruin. There's a new Oyo, but because I know that old Oyo was abandoned, I sort of find the ruins in the park and georeference the point to there. Sometimes it's not possible, and it's the ones that I can't identify where they were, I keep in the data because maybe someday someone will know where they are, or would want to know at least that existed. In other cases, there are maps produced by, historians, or things that will show, well, this place was located at the confluence of these two streams, this place was located on this mountain, and I sort of approximate the geographic location. So of course, some of these places would have been important at some point in time and not others. And so what I'm essentially getting here is sort of what we might think of as like the maximum location of a polity, even if that polity was changing a lot during this period. And so I'm not attentive, and I'm not sort of attempting to measure sort of the evolution of polities over time, in large part because although this would be very possible for some of the better studied political, centralized polities, this would be impossible for some of the ones where there's, one amazingly detailed dissertation from the 1970s, but we just don't know much else about these polities other than that. The other thing I would say, or I guess I would flag though, that, I do note when polities began or ended. So we could sort of eliminate polities that, collapse in, 1820, for example, from the data set. And the one exception is that I do distinguish between, Johannes's version of the, Abyssinia, the Solomonic dynasty, and then sort of Menelik's, conquest at the end of the 1900s or 19th century. So that's the one place where I sort of consider that to be two distinct polities. Okay, so then having found these centers of power, I need to sort of estimate sort of like where could power have been felt outside of these centers. And here sort of again, although I said I want to push back at Herbst, I am drawing on Herbst to the extent that I'm thinking about how power is projected outwards. And so I do this by engaging in cost distance calculations, in which I use an adaptation of what's known as Tobler's hiking method, which is an equation for thinking, given elevation, right, how fast can any individual walk in a set period of time? And so what you see here is estimates of how far you could walk from the centers of power that I code from Karagwe in Tanzania in 8 hours, and each of those bands represents 1 hour. So I'm using 8 hours as like my base data because I think it's a reasonable amount of time that a person could walk. That's about as far as I'd want to walk in any given day. But I also calculate this down to 6 hours and up to 10 hours, so we can sort of look at sort of the variation in how generous or restrictive we want to be in thinking about how power emanates outwards. So what this is doing is generating an estimate of where states were located. This is, of course, an imperfect estimate. There's a few things to note. So the first is that one thing that will impact enormously people's ability to walk is vegetation, but we simply don't know what the state of vegetation was in any area because all of our, remote sensing is, so heavily changed today that that's very hard to know. What I only include in the model is elevation, which you can sort of see displayed here. I make it possible for individuals to cross, or the calculation to cross rivers, but it imposes a cost, right? And sort of which I attempted to find out how fast a person could swim against the current and sort of come up with a reasonable estimate, right? It is not possible to cross bodies of water. So in reality, we know that there were canoes and known crossing points and known paths in many of these kingdoms. So if we think about like, Ivor Wilkes's work on the Ashanti, who clearly maps out these 8 roads out of Kumasi, but we don't know that for all states, and so I'm really sacrificing precision in some cases to come up with what I hope is sort of a reasonable estimate for all cases, right? And that's going to be unsatisfactory to some people. I think there could be a really cool, amazing mapping based on what I've seen of historical work for some polities, but I'm sort of engaging in a more generalist act here. What I can say is that this tends to correspond to estimates of travel or walk times that I've seen in the literature when they have been present. But what I'm not considering is, the availability of, say, horses or camels in the Sahel Belt, where we know that was sort of a main mode of movement in, say, Wade or something like this. So this is an estimate. I then sort of try to, or one way I try to sort of recognize the fact that there might be disagreement about this is to come up with what I'm calling sort of some uncertainty estimates. So I look to a number of historical atlases, but also I take scans of all of the maps that are produced that I find while researching these states. I then geo-reference all of the outlines, or sort of when they give a clear boundary of where they thought the state was, or the polity was, and I can compare that to my own measure. So on the left-hand side, you see the pre-colonial, or sort of the polity of Kenadougou in Mali, and sort of what is now predominantly Mali's Sekosa region. And you can see my estimate of where the state was located. And we see that there's sort of 3 estimates that I've been able to find in the literature. And we can see that some of them, like Yves Pearson's estimate from his book on summary, suggest that there's sort of more territory to the west. And in general, we see that there's more imprecision in the south. But I would say in general, where I'm estimating the state to be sort of looks to be covering most of the territory that, historians or others would suggest is covered by the state. There are other cases that are much harder, and we can see this illustrated well in the Ashanti. So here's my estimate of the location of like the Ashanti core. And we can see that sort of there's a big difference between sort of how people are identifying the core of the state, which is sort of like at that center, and then people who suggest when they sort of give an estimate of where the Ashanti were located are considering like all of the Ashanti's tributaries, right? So this would be areas like Gonja, Dagomba, etc. I also consider those states. I'm just coding them as separate polities, but we can start to see where for some cases there's a fair amount of imprecision, right? Based on sort of how people think about the state and have thought about measuring the state in the past. And we can sort of see this if we look at sort of my complete estimate of 8 hours, and then sort of the minimum and maximum, sort of the smallest and largest estimates that I find in the literature. And a lot of this imprecision tends to come in the Sahel Belt, where in particular, Wade, Four, et cetera, all are sometimes just given these huge masses of territory. But in what is admittedly like a very complex historical record, I'm sort of identifying sort of a much smaller set of points where at least we know there were important markets or leaders based. And so part of the idea of including this is sort of people can sort of, decide for themselves how generous they want to be or restrictive. So I've suggested a more encompassing I tried to sort of come up with a more robust conceptualization of what we mean by pre-colonial centralization. And then I've used this to develop what I hope is at least an improvement, if not a perfect measure, of where we saw centralized political institutions in 19th century Africa. And this allows me to return to the puzzle that animated the start of this talk. So, which was sort of this question of, was exposure to, centralization in, the prior to the onset of colonial rule, positive? Did it create development benefits in the long run, or was it negative? Did it sort of induce, conflict in the post-colonial era? And my measure allows me to do 2 things, which is to think about what happens if we first measure centralized political institutions and not culture, which is what the majority of the work has done. And then secondly, theorize how centralization might vary, as I alluded to earlier. So again, most work has said centralization is either or. There's sort of one paper that's an exception to this. And yet if we look at classic work on state formation in the West, or a growing body of work that's looked at state formation in Latin America, they really emphasize variation in how forms of political order evolved over time, with consequences for how we think about contemporary outcomes. So I really want to sort of come up with a way to sort of think about how the relationship in particular between elites and the periphery varied, right? By sort of suggesting as a way to sort of think about moving this literature forward. And so I come up with a typology that is draws in sort of perhaps some strange bedfellows, but a really short paper by Jan van Sienen, in which he says he sort of identifies very loosely 5 types of pre-colonial kingdoms in sub-Saharan Africa, but then also work by the sociologist Rogers Gould and some work he's done with a co-author, right? That sort of are attempting to sort of each in their own way think about the structure of relations between elites, because they want to sort of encourage us to think about how a polity is centralizing power, right? And in turn, sending, patronage and resources down to the periphery. And so there's 4 types that I develop, and I'm going to sort of look at empirically. The first is despotic. So this would be a polity where the monarch has the ability, I'm going to represent here with M, to appoint a broker, which would be sort of an elite further down the hierarchy, who's going to sort of monitor and extract resources from subjects. So in a despotic type, this is a term that comes from Vancina, right? The monarch has the ability to appoint brokers at will, right? And, we could think of this as sort of the most centralized form, right? So this outer bound is sort of, there's the heavily, the sense of political order is much more congealed around the monarch than some of the other types that I'm going to be talking about. So an example of this would be Jimma in Ethiopia, where the king, the monarch, ruled over provinces to which he had, almost full autonomy to appoint officials, right? He could appoint family members, which they certainly did over time, but also wealthy landowners, loyal slaves, mercenaries, etc. And then those brokers ruled over subjects. So what's important here, and the key distinction that Vancina makes in his essay, is that in these types, the monarch is not obliged to keep brokers in the family, and that those do not become hereditary positions. Once those become hereditary positions, right, this undermines the monarch's authority because they have a set of brokers that have their own sort of can develop their own autonomous power over time. So the second most centralized type, and the most common type by far in my data set, is a regal type. So again, I'm just using Vancina's terms here, which is here we have a monarch who appoints a broker from their own in-group to monitor out-group regions. So the broker in this case is going to be a representative of the core elite. It might be a co-ethnic, it might be someone from the royal lineage, etc. So to make this a bit more concrete, this would be, I would code the Adamawa Emirates, all of the Emirates in northern Cameroon, I think all of the Sokoto Emirates as well, where we have Fulani Ardos, right, who get a flag, they go to start the new emirate, and they appoint Fulani notables, often their family members, as territorial administrators over non-Fulani autochthons, right? So they're sort of, the Fulani are moving eastward at this time, and so they're going to, conquer new territory effectively, and they're, the Fulani amongst themselves as a core elite, right, are sort of, integrating or not, depending on how you think about it, the, indigenous population. The second, I guess what I would say here is, I think what's critical here from as a distinction is that then those sort of brokers sort of start to develop their own autonomy, and this is sort of what Vancina flags as a key difference. The third is the gatekeeper model, where here a monarch relies heavily on indigenous or outgroup brokers in outgroup regions. So what the monarch is doing here is sort of perhaps conquering territory and then sort of relying on indigenous chieftaincies to sort of ensure compliance at the local level and extract resources. Of course, we find this type, it's not simply that territory has just been conquered, right? So there are polities that are 300-400 years old that would fall into this model. But what's important is that the source of the broker's power comes from their relationship to the subjects and not their relationship to the monarch. So an example here would be Kabu, which is sort of a large, very decentralized empire in largely present-day Guinea-Bissau, where the emperor or monarch rules over these 45 provinces, each of which is headed by a mansa, right, who sort of emerges from that province, right? And the mansa is then collecting taxes and administering subjects, right? And although they sort of maintain, loyalty to the emperor, right, their authority is like rooted in their own sort of local polity. The last type would be a federation. So here a monarch rules with a council of brokers, but the members have substantial autonomy. And so we can think about this maybe as like a type of mediator relationship. This is the rarest type in my data. But the classic example of this is the Ashanti, or the example of the Inso that I gave earlier. So among the Ashanti in Ghana, the Santahine, the monarch, rules with a councillor, so represented here by, abstractly as a series of brokers, each of who sort of has their own relationships with subjects. So this typology is sort of attempting to follow from my concept by specifying distinct interactions between the nature of elite segmentation and core periphery relations, which I'm going to suggest can then reveal important variation from, despotic polities where sort of we would say power is much more centralized around the monarch or elite, right, to federations where it's more diffuse and there's sort of more avenues of, elite mobility. So just in case people want to have a sense of what this looks like distributionally, here's the count of polities that I'm including in each of these measures, and then some descriptive data on them. So on average, they don't vary significantly in size, but there are certainly some areas where they do vary a lot. So estimates, and of course, these are just estimates of population density in the 1800s, would suggest that there was far more population density in federations than in despotic areas. Despotic areas tend to have higher elevation. They tend to have yeah, and there's a number of ways in which these varies, and you can see some representative examples. I would say include the number of sources here, because I think one thing is it's possible that some of these types of policies are better studied, but in fact, the average number of sources, I would say doesn't sort of radically change. These would sort of be the number of historical sources that I use to code each polity. Happy to talk more about that. So I'm going to present some very quick results of models. I'm going to go back to some of this core finding and show that sort of I can both reproduce it, and that sort of by breaking down types of states, we actually see sort of pretty different implications about the long run legacies of precolonial political centralization. So again, thinking about can something improve development and conflict at the same time? So I divide the continent into 10 kilometer square grid cells. And then in each of those grid cells, I calculate a number of things, right? So using data from the UCDP and ACLID, I count some measures of conflict. So these are very common measures of conflict. So how many, conflicts are there? How many years of conflict between 1989 and 2013 to these cells? See how many battles. I then use nightlight data to measure development. So this is, again, a common measure in the literature. So, using stable like nighttime emissions, how much, luminosity at night is there in a cell? I take the average. And so the idea is that areas that have more economic activity are going to have brighter nighttime lights. And then a series of pretreatment controls, which are most of the geography measures that I just showed you, as well as the center of each grid cell's latitude and longitude and their interaction. And then for any grid cell where 25% or more of the territory is covered by one of my estimates of a pre-colonial or a political centralization in the 19th century, I'm considering that to have been exposed to those institutions. So I'm going to walk you through these. On the top, we see the coefficients of having been exposed to political centralization in the 19th century for conflict, and then at the bottom, development outcomes. And when you see that it's above the line with 0, what that effectively means is that there's a significant and positive relationship between exposure to centralization and those outcomes. So the top would tell us that in fact areas that were home or sort of exposed to centralized political institutions do see, and I logged these measures because they're heavily skewed, but sort of more years of conflict, more battles, et cetera. So in other words, I'm able to reproduce this finding that in fact, there does appear to be an increase in conflict in these areas, but there also seems to be some significant and quite high, improvements in nightlight densities, right? So again, there appears to be more conflict and more development. Once we break this down by type of state, however, we see really distinct findings. So these are the same results, but I've broken it down, as you can see, on the x-axis or the sort of horizontal axis, types of states. So here I'm comparing all grid cells across the continent. So the farthest to the left in each of these figures, coefficients, are just a dummy variable for whether or not an area was centralized or not. And then I show the effect of 3 of the 4 types. I can't run all 4 because they're collinear. So I'm omitting federations as the reference category. So even controlling for whether or not a grid cell was centralized, areas that were more centralized, so that were regal or despotic, see significant increases in conflict relative to less centralized areas, so federations in this case. And they also see worse development outcomes, right? Which would suggest that the conflict outcome is being driven by more centralized polities, and the development outcome is being driven by more decentralized ones. If we sort of just restrict the sample to only look at grid cells that are, to only compare amongst areas that were exposed to political centralization, we effectively see the same pattern. The results get a little more wobbly for nightlight density, but we can see that sort of it is really the despotic and regal polities that are sort of driving some of these conflict outcomes. So I'm going to stop the empirical analysis there, but what I want to suggest is that what this would tell us is that sort of by thinking about what we mean by political centralization and coming up with a measure that allows us to sort of recognize variation in it, we can see that there in fact sort of might be very distinct legacies of pre-colonial centralization, and that we're sort of confusing two very different processes when we sort of make these aggregate claims, yes or no, this area was centralized or not. This then has implications for thinking about a very important question where I think right now there's just a lot of hand waving in the literature about mechanisms of persistence. So why do these areas continue to see effects in the present? And so we might think, for example, that the fact that sort of more decentralized areas are not seeing these conflict effects and are seeing better development effects might be driven by some kind of accountability mechanisms, which is something some people have argued in other contexts, because elite status is less, concentrated, for example. I'm happy to talk more about some speculation on this or hear people's ideas about this. But what I want to suggest is just, it's not just that the past matters, but we have to think about sort of what the past looked like to understand why it might matter in different ways at different times. So I'm going to conclude very quickly, which is to say, I think that, we should not, for both ethical and social scientific reasons, rely on really quick measures of historical data and play it a bit, fast and loose with our, concept and measurement definition. I won't say that this was like a quick project, so I don't think it's something that we could sort of always do to this degree, but I think it's a demonstration, or I hope it's a demonstration of the way that we at least can do better, if not sort of, satisfy everyone, and sort of thinking about why the past matters, and sort of, again, really taking seriously the historiography of where we're, the context that we're working in. So I'm trying to sort of articulate, carve out room and a demand for better concepts and measures. But I also want to sort of then suggest that by doing so, we open up all sorts of ways to engage broader literatures on varieties of political centralization. So most of, at least in political science, the work on state building is still heavily dominated by the Western experience. There's been a couple really interesting books that have come out recently on, imperial China or in Latin America. But I think that Jeffrey Herbst still stands as sort of what people think about when they think about state building in Africa. And I think that's really unfortunate, because though I like the book, and as you've seen, I do, rely on certain claims, I think it really undersells, a lot of diversity that we did see. I'm going to conclude by just saying what I'm not doing here, and what no one is doing in this literature, is thinking about what we mean by like uncentralization, right? And so large swaths of the continent are being assigned a singular zero, that they were not centralized, when those areas also, of course, have really diverse political forms that I think could, deserve equal engagement, although I'm not doing it here. So thank you so much for listening. I hope this wasn't too abstract for people, and I really look forward to people's comments.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Wilfahrt, for a very interesting talk. I learned a lot. So, audience, it's time for questions and comments. You can write your questions, or you can just raise your hand and be allowed to ask your question directly. So I am not a specialist at all, but I have heard a lot of questions about using oral history, and just listening to you, it seemed that the data was mainly from other papers so I was just wondering, like, is there a way, or if did you include any oral history in the mapping and all those in the data? So what was the part of oral history in the data in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, only indirectly, to the extent that some of the main sources for a lot of these polities is, and there's just so many amazing dissertations that were written by people, often about areas that they were from, or people just went and collected a lot of oral histories. And so to the extent that that becomes part of the evidentiary basis of a series of claims that people are making in, again, often dissertations written at institutions such as your own, or UCLA or Northwestern, which is why I feel like I've read every history dissertation on a polity that ever came out of those institutions. Then they're considering that, that is an important source of data for many of them, or of those studies. And so I'm relying on that. There are certainly a couple polities that I think I don't have measured well. I have them measured, but it's not perfect. So, it would be great if I could go conduct oral histories, but it's just simply beyond the scope of my abilities. But yeah, so it's I would consider that very valuable data. It's just not data that I can systematically collect for all of these areas.
Thank you. I'm gonna allow Degrassi to speak.
Erin's seen a much earlier version of this presentation.
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Great to see the project moving along and really interesting to see these details. The question I did have was about the justification for the 8-hour walking time as the boundary and what's the kind of assumption behind that. Presumably people could walk for multiple days. I'm assuming that maybe it's related to like violent enforcement. So there's a secondary question there about whether this center periphery model premised only on extraction and enforcement has some limitations there versus a more kind of productive or a provisional sense of state capacity that's providing things, both material, not necessarily only patronage, but also in terms of cosmology and sense of belonging and values and identity, rather than just arguably a kind of reductive focus on material exchange.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I could rerun everything to include like 2 days of walking. I think that moves a lot further from what I see. Some of these where we do have a sense of how power was projected in more detail, then I think that a single day is just more consistent. And I'm sorry, I don't have any of those details in front of me. I should include them next time I give this talk. I think that there's a couple elements of it. So one is if part of what you are asking for people is tribute and that needs to be moved to the center, right? I think, carrying a bunch of, yams or grain or something for 2 days is just harder than, 1 day. So I think part of that was also just thinking about, the movement of people and goods across borders. But yeah, it's an assumption. And like, I can run it. I'm going to include my R code, so people are welcome to expand it. I would say that many of the states I think are smaller than this, right? And some are probably larger than this estimate. So it's an estimate. But I can look at making them larger than 10 hours. Yeah. As for the second point, that's absolutely right. The part about, cosmology, so for many of these kingdoms, the ideological apparatus of the state is, baked into sort of the centers of power, because what I'm seeing again and again in the historical record is that, here's a shrine, here is, a religious center that's extremely important to sort of how state power is projected. But that's not universally true, right? And so in some states, that's really sort of, there's not a lot of evidence for that. And so I'm a bit, to the extent that I'm trying to make a general data set, I'm a bit afraid of leaning too heavily into that. But yeah, it gets back to the same point. Like it's 8 hours or 1 day is, yeah, it's an estimate. But I'll run things larger and see what it looks like and how radically things change.
Thank you. Next, Solomon.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for that wonderful presentation. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, I can hear
you. That's very good. I'm Solomon Ochuo Oburu from Uganda, East Africa, a lecturer in history, African history, in Kampala University and the Busetema University in Uganda. I am touched by your presentation, and I would like you to comment on the following. One, what do you mean when you say that most African people were not ethnic? Seem to have got that statement. Then you are talking about centralization and patronage. That the leaders, for example, the Ashanti king, Opokoware, Obiri-Yeboah, Osei Tutus, owned wealth, especially gold. Was it for personal accumulation? In Uganda, we had the Buganda kingdom. The king, the Kabaka, was the owner of all wealth, including women. The most beautiful women in Buganda belonged to Kabaka. But that one was both in form and in substance, because the king owned everything, not for himself, but for the population. He leads up to today. The Kabaka is the owner of everything, but ensures that the population shares. And we find that in such kingdoms, development occurred. You can see the Kemet population in Egypt. Because of that centralization, the pharaohs made tremendous development. We see even the Menelik in Ethiopia. You go to Monomotapa Kingdom in Zimbabwe. There was a lot of learning and mathematics, and they built the Great Wall of Zimbabwe. Now, how can the prosperous pre-colonial centralized polities develop, and then when it comes to after colonialism, the linkage brought under development? We can see that in some of these uncentralized or decentralized states, people existed because there was a leader who protected them and even provided, and they were more democratic in decision making. People were freer in decentralized states like Jopado Laluo of Uganda, the Chewa, the Bemba of Central Africa, and others. And provision for economic benefits, social life, security were provided for by those people, the leaders of people who seem not to be living in centralized states. And today, we find that some of these societies are more prosperous than even the former decentralized kingdoms. Mm-hmm. Now, may you comment on this after those remarks? You have said that the more centralized, the more conflict, and so less development in that region. That the more centralized a society was, the more conflict visited them, and therefore less development today. May you clarify on those, Dr.
Yeah,
Solomon? Thank you.
These are excellent questions. Thank you. So first, I just want to clarify. I didn't mean to say that most people were not ethnic. I apologize if that's what I said by accident. What I meant to say was that I think it's very few places where you could say, that a centralized polity was only one ethnic group, right? That in most cases, polities were home to sort of really diverse ethnic groups, right? And so even if the ethnic hierarchy was maintained by one ethnic group, and I think the Great Lakes are maybe like where this argument gets pushed a little, but the area that I've spent the most time and where I've done most of my field work in West Africa and Senegal, the Baoul or Saloum, and they had well-integrated ethnic minorities, right? So I just wanted to say that I don't think we should equate, political institutions with ethnic groups. That I think that's a dangerous move in the literature. But of course, everyone had, ethnic identities, of course. So, this point about all these things polities do. I think this gets in some ways to Aaron's point, which is, the extraction of wealth. And maybe I should be more careful in how I talk about this. It's not just like for self-enrichment, although it often does allow people to maintain their elite status, but that, many of these polities are doing all sorts of things. So they're, as Aaron mentioned, ensuring cosmological systems in some places. They are reinforcing the power of local brokers and providing them resources. They're providing assistance in the case of famine from granaries, right? So I don't mean to make this sound too materialistic in that sense, because obviously there is a reciprocal, like, downward provision that is happening. And I guess maybe I've been using the word patronage, and that's not particularly precise. So I should maybe think about nuancing that more to come up with a term that sort of can capture all of these things that we know these polities were doing. So they're both extracting, but right, that extraction, that surplus is allowing them to do things to maintain their authority, right? So that's absolutely correct. So I would be more nuanced in how I talk about that. Yeah, to your, I guess concluding point, I think these are on average effects, right? And I think in this way, I think some of the best work in this literature has focused on specific cases. So like Elliot Green and Bandipari have a great project paper on Uganda, where they really actually sort of take very seriously the Bugandan state and think about how that might have led to long run development improvements, which they do find for the Buganda. And so, some of this might just be a relic of sort of looking at continent-wide effects, right? Versus sort of taking seriously specific cases, which is what I did in, I guess, my first book, and which, I think where you tend to get sort of much more nuanced and arguably accurate insights, right? But I guess the claim that I would make here is that, I'm not trying to say, and I guess is the point I was trying to conclude on, that we don't see political order absent centralized polities. That's just not true. That, political order exists everywhere. It's, humans do not like living without political order. And that, there are leaders, and there are, as you mentioned, sort of in some of these areas that would sort of not enter into my data set, really robust traditions of, democratic or pseudo-democratic political organization, and those, they also have leaders who are doing things, and they're also organizing for cooperation. And I guess this is what I meant when I was trying to say, that we really have, I think this literature, at least development economists and political scientists, have really black boxed what is also a really dynamic and interesting set of communities there. And I'm not sure I'm going to take that one on, but I really encourage someone to think about that. But yeah, I hope I answered all of your questions. I'm not sure I noted them all down perfectly.
Thank you. I will let Monte answer.
Monty McMurtry, listening in from Toronto, Canada, with some experience in Africa, 30 years, which means that I don't know very much or understand very much. And my comment to you is that what does this mean for present day political social publics in African governance? And I'm referring explicit to two areas that I know somewhat: Liberia, where I was former country director, and Congo, where I've been based off and on for the past 10 years, because you raise some very interesting insights, notwithstanding that the similarities exist today, that governance or power is privileged to be maintained, regardless of what may be considered to be prescriptively judicially correct. So are you able to draw any lines that present day practitioners can use, and more importantly, share in terms of what I hope in development construct to encourage local leaders to understand that governance is service, not privilege and aggrandizement? Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't know that I have the answer you're looking for. It's above my pay grade. But I guess what I would say is that, I think that one, so I would say in recent decades, what we've seen, I think a lot of political science, but not all, and then in a lot of development economics is sort of a bifurcation, right? So you have this one stream of work that's really interested in sort of like social engineering. So we're going to run a bunch of RCTs and find out like how we can nudge or sort of get people to sort of engage in what we think are development maximizing behaviors. And I think the other side has like really moved to this long run history. And those are radically different ideas of sort of how we think about development. It's either something that's very amenable to change with sort of small inducements, or it's something that is like completely determined by things that happened 150 years ago. I don't find either of those satisfying personally, even though I'm doing this project. But what I would say is that I think if we think that the past, and more in a more distant past than the colonial past, and of course that's a debate in and of itself, still matters for how people think about their political identities, think about their relationship to the current state that they live within, is influenced in some way by a longer term past, then I think only by sort of taking that past seriously can we sort of understand that relationship. So let's think about the literature on conflict. So one argument that's been made by Jack Payne is that the reason we see more association between countries that had more centralized political order in the sort of prior to the onset of colonial rule is that this creates a subnational security dilemma, that essentially you have a large number of groups who, are vying for power and who have this sort of well-formed identity and cohesion rooted in this pre-colonial polity, right? And so that would suggest, I think, we could develop, although he doesn't, I don't think in the paper, clear implications for what that might mean for thinking about how groups are outbidding each other at the national level, right? And sort of, arguably by taking those identities seriously and the ways that groups are then making claims upon the state, for example. I think you could develop policy implications there. As for development, I think some of that's a little trickier, right? We know that development is very path dependent and not deterministic, right? But, if we think to this paper I just mentioned about Uganda, so their claim is that it's really about private wealth acquisition that is facilitated in areas like the territory of the former Buganda Kingdom, and it's not that they're sort of getting more goods from the British colonial state per se, that's a different problem than, say, state favoritism of certain regions. So I think we could develop policy implications. How to foster better leadership, I think is not something that I have a ton of insight into. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Any more questions or comments? Okay. Emukule? Go ahead and ask your question, Emukule.
Fantastic. I was looking at, first of all, great research. It's really thorough. Thank you for sharing. I just wanted to also talk about these policies. Did you look at any changes that seem to have been peaceful from kind of policies that had significant influence over the societies? Was it transitions that were peaceful and generally accepted as, okay, these are the new guys in charge in that way?
You mean in these episodes of history?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have I think I have in my notes, I could sort of think about this more systematically. I think I think a really rough proxy would be like states that were just being formed. So if we think about, Samori Toure, who's conquering huge amounts of territory in West Africa in like the 2 decades, starting in the 1870s, it's as if he'd had, in the counterfactual world, if there'd been 50, 100 years between that and, French colonial conquest, we could imagine that would have been a much more established polity, right? And that there might have been, maybe that would have, changed the course of history, sort of had that look differently. Because we certainly know that sort of at the onset of colonial rule, colonial powers are negotiating, and they are, I don't want to say receptive, but at times slightly receptive to some of the claims being made by some of these political leaders. So in that sense, I think it could be very interesting to think about sort of where some of these like new political forms were more or less established and whether or not that produces a difference. And can we sort of use that to think about, counterfactuals to assess what we think might have happened. One thing I want to do with the data is sort of think about how this then impacts like post-colonial borders, but also like that transition, and I haven't done it yet. But that's a great question. I'll think about it more and see what I can do.
Just one more, if you don't mind. I'm also interested in how some of these policies sold themselves to the general population. Was it always violence, or were they some guys who actually had some sort of political agenda? Did they sell themselves as? Were they always selling themselves as king or violently, or were there some who were selling the unified factor as things spread?
Yeah. So I'm going to have this sort of rough proxy of like state ideology, which is meant to be like, how is the state legitimating itself? So, there are certainly many polities that are really have a cosmological justification, and where, I mean, this is like, this term is contested now, but like ideas of divine kingship, or that there is something about, political, leadership that is tied to, powerful spiritual forces that sort of ensure good crops and good rain and these types of things, right? And so sometimes there is a really robust ideological apparatus. There's also a lot of trading states where sort of essentially the state justifies itself. These often tend to be very small city states where the political order justifies itself because they ensure and facilitate trade. But there's also a number of just like what I have sort of my generic residual category is like hereditary monarchies, where you just have a monarchy that's been established and they have they have brokers or other elites posted in the periphery, and they are taxing, but there also are providing food relief and protection and these types of things. But so I have attempted to think about sort of how they, how we might think about diverse forms of legitimation that will be in the data set, but it's still going to mask a fair amount of variation.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Questions, comments? Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Wilfahrt. That was a very interesting talk. We appreciate you coming and sharing with us. Thank you to the audience too for coming and asking questions. We'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.